This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today. Laura's actually worked with Cornell Garden-Based Learning on a lot of our small fruit advanced training, as well as our regular just fruit care PowerPoints that we use in the main core Master Gardener volunteer training. And she completed her undergrad at Cornell and her master's degree at University of Florida, and has been working with Extension since 1990. So thank you so much, Laura, for joining and teaching us a little bit of your expertise. If you want to introduce yourself a little bit better and add anything, go for it. But yeah, it looks like we have a good group today. We have about 13 folks from a couple different counties. We've got Albany County and Allegheny. Looks like Cattaraugus and Jefferson are all here, as well as some educators and extension associates here on campus. So thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll let Laura take it away.
Great, thanks Ashley for inviting me. So let me just tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing right now. I used to work with kind of general horticulture in Washington County Cooperative Extension, which Washington County is over on the eastern side of the state, right along the Vermont border. And my home is in Granville, New York, which is right on the Vermont border, literally a mile and a half or so from the border. Now I have been working for a number of years, not really sure exactly how long, but quite a few years, as the berry specialist with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program, which is a regional program. We cover 17 counties in Eastern New York, kind of up and down the Route 87 corridor. And I work with commercial berry growers, and also do some troubleshooting with vegetable growers as well. So I don't do any more Master Gardener specific work. I do teach the Master Gardener training in a number of counties in the East, but I don't coordinate any events. But I kind of understand what you guys are up against. I think it's not up against anything really. It's a great group to work with, but it's a lot. It's people's interests from the general gardening public and from the Master Gardener volunteers themselves are very diverse. So it's a lot of things to cover and kind of be the expert of, because they're going to be constantly looking to you as the expert. So this program is really just, it is something that Lori Brewer, Ashley's predecessor, I believe, and I put together quite a long time ago, and I don't use it in my formal Master Gardener training, but I thought this would be a good format, this presentation, to kind of use as a springboard for our discussion, because we also have a fairly wide umbrella of topics that we're trying to cover today. And I'm going to make the presentation available to everybody. My hope is that you might be able to use it, alter it as you will, and just use it, or use the recording of today's presentation, whatever it is, or just learn a little bit of something. I also, because it's a nice small group, I am really hopeful that you will interrupt me if you have questions. Some of it I'm going to go pretty quick over because I think it's fairly rudimentary, and you probably have already been exposed to some of it during Master Gardener trainings. But if I do that and you're like, wait a minute, what is she talking about? Just interrupt me. Thanks for those of you who I have a number of people that I miss seeing in person. So Sharon and Dan and Holly, how are you? And Sue, and those of you I don't know well, I'm glad to see you joining us. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so we're just going to be talking about growing fruit in the garden landscape. And all right, let me see if I can remember. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here are our learning objectives for today. And, you know, this is just to kind of keep us on track. So we're going to talk about those keys to success. And this is kind of the thing that you probably have heard before ad nauseum, right? The whole thing about before planting, we'll talk about site, plant needs, scale, and soil health. And then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about some of the tree fruit, the vine fruit, bush fruit, and then what we call ground cover or low growing plants. And there are other plants other than strawberries in that category. We're going to do a little bit of outlining the IPM approach. And then I'd like to talk briefly about understanding permaculture and its place in climate change mitigation and adaptation. I probably should have put that there. Identify a few resources that hopefully you know about, but if you don't, that you'll be able to think a little bit more about how to use them with your general gardening public or your master gardener volunteers. And then I love if we have a little bit of time left after we kind of do some of this resource identification, is maybe have a little chat about ways that you as educators could take this information and move it forward. So this is really going back to basics, but it's probably the most important thing that I think we can do when we're, especially when we're talking about perennial plants, is that planning and preparing. Those two steps are absolutely imperative. And I talk to my berry growers, especially new growers, about this, that this is, you cannot, it's that first year or two prior to planting is that will kind of determine your success, and it's no different for gardeners. And then going back to some of these questions, because these are really important for the gardening public and the master gardener volunteers that you work with. The whole point about growing fruit plants is that you want fruit. And if your plants are not setting fruit and you're not getting fruit from them, then that's where the questions are going to come in. And some of the questions would, or some of the things that you could train your volunteers or talk to your the gardening public about is just questions about the historical life of the fruit. Has it produced fruit in the past? Has it ever produced any fruit? And then if it's no, then talking about how old the plant is and trying to help people understand juvenile periods of mostly tree fruits, but certainly even things like blueberries, kiwis. That juvenile period of a fruit is really important. And a lot of that will be determined by the rootstock. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about that. But that's really important, understanding what that juvenile period means. And then if in fact the plant has produced fruit in the past, did it produce flowers this year? And then if it's no, talking about what are the low winter temperatures? That usually indicates whether or not we're going to have fruit buds. And if the answer is yes, was there a late spring frost? Is that the explanation? Is the explanation more about cold or rainy weather during bloom? And if it is a self-fruitful crop, maybe that cross-pollination piece is more important than the gardener understood, and trying to pick that apart is important. So pollination is really a challenge and is really, really important for fruit crops. So then if none of these, if you can't kind of figure it out from that, then going to the next thing about how is the plant cared for, the nutrition and management, and what about noticeable diseases or pest issues? And those things, including pruning, are going to be really important to try to kind of parse what is happening with that fruit. And I think putting these questions out there in the beginning of a training is really important because it helps us go back while we're learning about culture, is to try to revisit why that would have been important to this very, this kind of constant question from gardeners. Why won't my plants have fruit? So Then let's talk about site consideration, because this is the huge, the big important question prior to planting. So first of all, these little this little drawing, this guy lugging water. This year, it's hard to imagine that we ever would be worried about water availability. It seems like, especially in our region, it has been just one rain event after another. And so we have plenty of water. In some cases, we have too much water, but water is key to fruit production. The fruit are 90-something% water, and so they really have to have a good availability of clean, high quality water. Your pest, like mostly for mammals and birds, that this is just a reminder, like if you've got a lot of deer predation, it's going to be extremely difficult to reliably grow fruit. And that's just something that we're going to have to deal with. And we can talk about that in a bit. Sun, I bring the sun up because all of the plants we'll talk about pretty much are full sun requiring, and that means 6 to 8, 6 minimum, 8 kind of, but as much sun as humanly possible will help with the fruit quality. And that is difficult for a lot of gardeners or homeowners to understand, because they may have a mature landscape with, you know, large shade trees, and that's going to be really tough for them to grow high quality fruit in that situation, but not impossible. There are some fruit that they could grow, and maybe they can even incorporate it into a smaller garden that's put in the front of the house or what have you. But we so just thinking about sun exposure. And then the 2 maps here, the one on the left is all about hardiness zones. We're not going to spend a ton of time, and most of you, because you are gardeners, understand hardiness zones. They've been shifting for the last 20 years, and we had 10 or 12 years ago a fairly significant USDA hardiness zone shift, whereas Washington County now is a warm 4 or 5, cold 5, warm 4, where we never used to be that way. The other thing is about growing degree days, and I don't think that most of our fruit, we really have to worry so much about that. That's really important for annual crops. Some of the tree fruit, certainly some apple varieties that require a lot of growing degree units. My best example of that is a Golden Delicious. Everybody would love to plant Golden Delicious, but if you're up in the foothills of the Adirondacks, you're not going to be able to get enough heat units to get a good quality Golden Delicious, or a what's another good one? I'm just having even Gala is kind of tricky, but mostly in our fruit areas we can grow them. But so that's just something to keep in mind. And then this, I always used to think this was kind of a funny little thing for that. This is from the Cornell Guide to Home Fruit Planting, which most of you who've been in the system for a while know this very well. It's a really great booklet. It's now available online. I don't think it's not being printed anymore, but you might be able to find print copies. But they have this chart in there, which is, it just kind of lines out what kind of amount of yield you might be able to get. And when somebody starts to really think about the fact that you could get an apple on a dwarfing rootstock, an M9 rootstock, one tree could give you 60 pounds of fruit. If you have one on a semi-dwarf rootstock, you could get 300 pounds of fruit. That's a lot of fruit for one homeowner to deal with. And so trying to point that out to somebody in the beginning of their venture, that makes a big difference to how they plan, what they do to utilize that. It's very important. And I also point to the harvest period because strawberry, we actually have other varieties now that stretch this harvest period a lot. So that's not entirely true anymore. but harvest period is important just to know, when the homeowner, are they leaving for their Florida vacation, like in September? That's not going to jive very well. So just trying to remind people about that. I think this is actually a very valuable piece of information to share with folks in the very beginning. And then keys to success, there's nothing more important than soil health. We're learning about that for a whole bunch of reasons, but trying to help people, especially for people that want to plant perennial crops. I do definitely, the pH test kit is going to be important, but even the complete soil analysis is really very important for folks that want to be successful. And then talking to them about cover cropping, and these pictures are all from that booklet and the Master Gardener training. So I'm not going to go into that a lot because I think you all do tons of work trying to train people and help people understand how to use these tools, but that's very important. So let's talk a little bit specifically about growing trees. Pome fruits, apples and pears, and then peaches, cherries, and plums are in the stone fruit family. Choosing cultivars are really, really important. Trying to make sure that you put the right plant in the right place. And then cross-pollination as required is going to be very important. Now, when we were talking just a little bit ago about the size of the tree and the fact that maybe a lot of home gardeners would only be able to put one tree in their yard, one fruit tree. Think about the fact that crab apples, ornamental crab apples, who have a very long bloom time, can act as a cross-pollinator for many of those fruit crops. So, or the tree fruit varieties. So that's a really good way to get around a cross-pollination need. I usually try to encourage people to plant 2 different varieties because I think that gets that whole piece of, oh, this variety is self-fruitful, this variety is not self-fruitful. If you plant 2, you're guaranteed, but if they just don't have room and there's a crabapple somewhere in the vicinity of their neighborhood, they'll be fine. And yeah, I just think that that's kind of an important piece to make sure that they understand that. Does anybody have any questions about cross-pollination? Most apples do benefit from having a different pollinator in the vicinity. Pears as well. Stone fruits is less of a problem. Most stone fruits are self-fruitful, so you can easily get away with a single peach. Okay, hearing nothing.
Look, Laura.
Yes, is that Dan? Hi, Dan.
It is. Long time no see.
I know it.
Question for you on the cross-pollination, and knowing you're not a tree fruit person, but do ornamental pears that sometimes get planted like on roadsides and stuff, will those cross-pollinate?
I believe they will. The problem with the ornamental pears, I don't know if you've noticed, they have actually a fairly brief, relative to a crab apple, they have a fairly brief bloom period. So they're lovely and very showy, but they don't have the same benefit of that. Crab apple can cover a bloom time, several different early, mid, even some late season apples. So they really do a good job that way. Pears, they just don't have that coverage. So
Yep.
Having said that, we have a pear tree out in front. It's the only pear that I'm aware of out in front of the Washington County office, or we used to actually, we had to take it down because of fire blight. And for years and years, I worried that it's not going to get pollinated. And then it got to be about 3 years old and it set fruit every single year. And I couldn't even find an ornamental pear in the vicinity. So it was somehow getting pollinated, and maybe it was just self-fruitful enough, but it really did a great job. So I think that is, it's something to consider, but this, for most of our homeowner needs, these plants will oftentimes, the self-fruitfulness will be adequate.
Okay.
And
Thanks,
almost,
Laura.
yeah, it almost covers up for the fact that they probably won't thin the crop.
Right.
So there's like, yeah.
Okay.
All right. So the apple rootstock, and I think a lot of you folks understand that most of our, virtually all of our varieties now are in the trade, are grafted plants. And this is much different than the age of Johnny Appleseed, when everything was seedling plants, which then there was a lot of variability. And I always bring this up because the best chapter or description of the genetic variation of apples I think ever written was Michael Pollan in his chapter on apples in the book Botany of Desire. And that is just really, if you guys haven't read that book, it's a horticulture, it's really fascinating. It's a great book. So that talks about the genetic variation and why, one of the biggest reasons why propagating these vegetatively became so important is just to try to cut down on that variation so that the apple nursery trade could proceed and kind of provide some kind of useful plants reliably. So the rootstock is grafted onto the scion, which is the cultivar. Sometimes there's even interstems in plants that are sold commercially. And the rootstock imparts a lot of different characteristics to the scion. And one of them is cold hardiness. One of them is precocious bearing. One of the characteristics is cold hardiness, precocious bearing, and size reduction, obviously. So they were initially, the rootstocks were developed because of that cold hardiness, to try to get some ability for some of these varieties to get through really harsh winters. And then they realized, wow, the other traits that are being perpetuated, that smaller stature, that completely revolutionized the entire fruit industry. So that was super important. And there's some little bit of disease resistance also given by the rootstock, but none of that really changes what is grown up here. The type of apple that you're growing is not impacted. I mean, a Granny Smith is going to be a Granny Smith, is going to be a Granny Smith, regardless if it's on a dwarfing stock or a semi-dwarf. And so these are just kind of a little bit of a description of the size. An M9 is the most dwarfing rootstock that we have still. It usually results in an 8-foot tree. And then all of these, M26, M7s, M106, M111s, these are still some of the most important rootstocks, semi-dwarf rootstocks in the trade. And sometimes there's a whole bunch of different versions of them, but basically they'll go from a 12-foot tree to a 24-foot tree. So it's really important to kind of know, if your gardener wants to have a small tree, they really should be planting on a dwarf rootstock. And then when it says semi-dwarf, they might need to talk to the nurseryman and try to tease out, is it an M26 or is it an M111 that you're planting on? And usually the nurseryman will be able to share that with them. So the other thing that will impact the overall size of the tree is obviously how fertile the soil is, and then your cultural practices, how heavily you prune, how well you take care of the plant, how much you fertilize the plant. All of that will, result in a different size plant. But this is the big thing, is how what those rootstock is. And it's not just apples that have rootstocks, it pears, and there's only a few rootstocks. This is the predominant one. It's a Farmingdale cross with Old Home. Plums and prunes have some rootstocks as well. Peaches, there's about 3 different rootstocks for peaches. And then cherries are routinely planted on one of these 2 rootstocks. And those are primarily for winter injury, but also a little bit for disease resistance. It doesn't do as much with size control. And that's a kind of a complaint from pear growers. And one of the reasons that growers give for not planting as many pears, because they don't have a good size controlling rootstock for pears. And so pears get to be quite tall. Cherries, same thing. These are the aggressively growing plants. But at this point, we just don't have a lot available in the trade for size reduction. So any questions about rootstocks? It's a pretty important thing to understand and help your gardeners understand is what characteristics that rootstock imparts to the cultivar. Okay, so pruning and training, again, starting really early when the plant is young, first year. I love this particular picture because when these plants are just setting out those first year succulent shoots, you can use something as easy as a clothespin just to kind of push the branch down, and horizontal branches. Horizontal branches are just usually much stronger. They're slower growing. Slower growing means more fruitful wood and less vegetative wood. So remember, we're trying to grow these plants for fruit production, not just for a lovely landscape specimen. So it's a very different approach. So you're constantly trying to slow down the growth of the plant. And one of the ways to do that is to make these branches grow horizontally. So this little drawing that's in the Master Gardener training is important because it talks about theoretical things that you're looking for when you're pruning larger plants. And so the leaves obviously should be on this plant at the same time. But when we look at some wood that is vertical, very straight up and down with not a lot of small internodes developed here, this is very vegetative. And so we're looking for 3 different pruning, taking this out. And so this is where you would take this out. You would take this out right here so that you don't have your fruit shaded by a lot of vegetative growth. And then what that will do is help you break more buds and maybe set more buds right here on this fruity wood. This kind of dead end branch where maybe it was broken or just poor pruning right here left a stub, that should be brought back so that you get this nice horizontal growth. All the energy is going into that wood. And this kind of downward growth is all this spur growth here. Even though there's a lot of fruity wood here, it's all going down, and that means it's going to be shaded above. So the fruit that comes out of that is going to be fairly low quality. So maybe a pruning cut right here. Oops, let me go back. So 3 pruning cuts right here to keep the fruit quality and take out the vegetative wood, here to take off dead wood and kind of help move the energy towards this fruiting with lots of spur growth. And then here that takes off the fruity wood, but it's poorly positioned. So those kinds of thoughts when you're pruning is important. And then maximizing light interception. And these are just indications of why size matters. So say this is a larger tree, maybe it's a 24-foot tree that's been trained to a pyramidal, a kind of a central leader format, which is basically this pyramid. So what happens is that you get a much larger interior. So this has less than 50% light here, but all the exterior of that plant has greater than 50%. So that's what you need to have high quality fruit. As the tree gets smaller, the percent of poor quality light decreases because the tree is so much smaller, right? So in an 8 or 10 foot tree, you get a very small percentage of interior poor lighted area, so that the vast majority of the fruit that is going to be produced is going to be out here in the exterior of the canopy, which is 85% of the plant canopy. So that's another reason for encouraging folks to plant things on smaller trees, and why the industry has gone in that direction as well. Also because of safety, you don't have to have a ladder to get up here to harvest. It's just quicker. So, but this kind of revolutionized the way, the importance of going small with tree size. And then if somebody ever wanted to talk about Espalier or kind of these other training systems, there's lots and lots of different training systems out there, all of them hell-bent on trying to get a really maximize the amount of light that's going into that canopy. And then here's just a visualization of, on the left are some peaches that were in the interior of the tree that didn't get enough light, and on the outside they got full light and they colored up really well. They're going to be a much higher quality fruit. So that's part of the rationalization for that. And then just basic pruning information, sharpening tools, getting good quality stuff. I should have had a little demo here, but I got a year ago or so, actually right before the pandemic hit, I got a backpack, an electric backpack pruner. And if you ever wanted to really drop some change, or if your association was feeling super flush, those things are great to have a pruning demonstration with, because people will it helps them to understand how much they should be more aggressive about pruning. And even when you have a demonstration, when you're doing the pruning, it's hard to keep it up while you're talking and pruning at one time. So having that pole pruner that has an automated, electric battery with it makes it a lot easier. I did one last spring and it worked out really well. So some of the other things that we can encourage growers to think about, or homeowners to think about, oops, I didn't spell Amelanchier, Juneberry. Amelanchier has an I in there, I'll have to fix that. But serviceberry, shadbush, all of those are small trees, and those Juneberries, although we think of them as berry plants, they actually are small trees. And I really think this category of plant is going to be great for, as a new plant, something interesting to try. It ripens before spotted wing gets really bad. It's a native, so it doesn't have a terrible lot of problems. We have some rust issues with it, but it's a great plant. Cornelian cherry is also a tasty cherry. It's not a cherry at all. It's a dogwood. As you can see, this is the picture of Cornelian cherry, and you can tell that by that leaf veination in the leaves. It's definitely a dogwood. But other plants that are more minor tree fruit are mulberry. Mulberry can be grown everywhere. Most of the people that I've seen trying to grow this have actually, they're growing it as a multi-stem shrub. Same with Amelanchier. And that way you've got more fruiting surface, which is small. These mulberry is going to be able to be grown literally everywhere in the state. The fruit is delicious for those of you who haven't ever tried it. Very delicious. It probably is going to have bird netting on it, but it doesn't require any special soils. It's kind of grows in a lot of different soil situations, and doesn't need to have a cross pollinator. Pawpaw, the only thing wrong with mulberry is that you really are going to have to keep pruning it, because even when you prune it to a multi-stem shrub, it just wants to grow. It's a very vigorous plant, wants to grow big. We don't have any way with a rootstock to control the size yet, but it could be kind of an unusual and interesting fruit to have in a garden. Pawpaw, many of you probably have tasted pawpaw. We cannot grow it about north of even Columbia, kind of Hudson. I would say Hudson, New York is about as far north as I've heard it being grown. It's just a little cold sensitive, but yet there's a nursery in the Mohawk Valley. They're selling stock, so they're able to grow as a nursery plant. It's just that the fruit part is a little bit more susceptible to cold, that's a common problem. You can grow the plant, but you can't grow the plant where we'll have fruit, and that's true with peaches, with some of the other stone fruit, nectarines, certainly really kind of difficult to grow them in different areas of the state. Beach plums, buffalo berry, quinces, all of these could also be what we call edible fruit trees. And then if those of you who have never gone to the North American Fruit Explorers, maybe we'll try to go to their website after I'm done here. But that's a great source of information. So I really encourage you to think about that. So next, let's go to vines, growing vines. Before I leave the tree area, does anybody have any questions? Nope. Okay. So grapes and go ahead.
I do have one question. I was just curious if you mentioned mulberries are good in urban settings. Of those other trees, would you say Melantier is also good for like an urban setting, like more maybe compacted soil or maybe not the best soil? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that probably certainly beach plums would really be fine for soil challenged, and buffalo berry. Quinces, I'm not positive about. And quinces also are a relative of the apple, so they have a pretty significant pest complex. But Amelanchier, I bet shadbush might do okay in a kind of a compacted soil situation if you were able to do just a little bit of modification to it. And pawpaw's a question mark for me. I just don't know enough about pawpaw to say. I know that it does not mind alkaline soils, but that's and that might help it with a urban setting, but that's all I know. I think they're all worth giving it a try because I think all of them could be a great addition to an urban garden.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So first, we grow pawpaw in Ontario, and we have fruits every year. So
where is this? Where is that, Lucy? Where do you grow them?
In Ontario County.
Ontario County?
Yeah. So, and we have fruits every year, easy to grow. They ripe very well, 2 trees. And we have them probably for 15 years now.
So is Ontario County, is most of that that ground right next to the Great Lakes? Are you bordering one of the Lake Ontario?
It's not very close, but yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Well, I wonder if maybe that's helping you more than we think. I don't know for sure. All I know is that we haven't, and maybe it's an altitude thing too, because we get a fair, we have a lot of hills in our region. So maybe the sighting of this, it just is harder. Maybe we're getting more late spring frost incidences or just the periodic cold temperature. I don't know. That's a really good question though. Maybe we're just not trying the right varieties of pawpaw, and I don't even know if there are that many different varieties. That's how little I know about it. I know there's several that are planted down in the lower Hudson Valley that there's a couple of growers that are actually growing them, but it's just not, it's a great plant. It's a great
It is, and it's
fruit.
beautiful actually. It's beautiful in the fall.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be a wonderful addition to
And it's
to a
not
home
very
garden.
heavy, and it's very reachable. It's easy to maintain also.
Hmm.
But also I have a question. This year I tried to mulberry from branches. Is that, should I expect anything? It will be grown. It's still, I see one of them have a lot of leaves. So, but can we grow mulberry from branches?
Yes, definitely. They do quite well from vegetative propagate, kind of branch propagation like
I
that.
can't even
Yep.
use for rooter, what is called special things to
A
root.
little rooting hormone. Is that what?
I can't even use this. So I just pick it, put in a pot, and keep this like greenhouse, and it did not root in but start to give a leaf. So I put this on a yard, and it's keep growing. So I hope I will have, because I have a mulberry one tree, and it's so delicious, just very delicious.
Great. Yeah, I like mulberry myself. It is messy if the birds get into it. That's my only caveat.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Great. And there's this group, the North American Fruit Explorers, is really, really helpful. But so grapes and Hearty Kiwi. There's a lot of different grape types. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on them. Most of everything really, but the muscadine can be grown somewhere in our state. There's a lot of different disease susceptibility. I mean, especially when you're trying to think about growing grapes for wine production, the disease complex is quite aggressive for grapes. And so the possibility of spraying, or the requirement for spraying fungicides is fairly high. And certainly in a year like this year, it's just been really hard with downy and powdery mildew. But there are differences in some of these varieties for their ability to, resist these diseases. So something like Catawba is a lot better than, say, this Cayuga, or Folk. Marichal Folk is a very popular wine grape variety, which requires a fair amount of spraying. Here's just some common things to keep in mind. One thing that when I'm teaching master gardeners is that it's so hard to help gardeners in general understand about timing and life cycles of pathogens. Is that I really think that helping them, sitting down with them with a disease cycle in front of them and trying to explain that for something like black rot or botrytis, which are fruit rots, these sprays are the kind of the management opportunity is right around bloom time. And so having them actually kind of go to their smartphone and plug in, like sometime in, maybe mid-May, put a little note there that you're going to have to spray for black rot when those things are right before or right after bloom, or sometimes both. And just putting that note into their calendar so that they remember, go to that fruit, maybe even with a link to the disease pathway, so that they can remind themselves about when and what and where to be spraying. But fruit rots, very important to kind of think about the fact that bloom is a trigger for that. And then downy and powdery mildew, any kind of leaf fungi, just trying to draw the correlation between weather to that, helping them understand that the more humidity, the more rain, the more pressure we have for these kinds of pathogens. And that there are organic chemicals out there that we can help them find, but it is still, you're still spraying. You're still spraying, and a lot of people don't want to spray anything, and that's somewhat unrealistic if they still anticipate trying to get some fruit from these plants. Does anybody have any questions about kind of general pest management with very difficult to manage crops like apples and grapes? It's just a challenge. So pruning and training, we spend a lot of time trying to help people understand how important pruning is to invigorating the plant, and that if you let old wood stay on a plant, old wood is less fruitful. So the longer some wood stays on there, even a couple of years old, can really reduce the overall production, let alone the fact that it reduces the overall quality of the fruit, because you've got shading, you have poor air circulation. But the old wood in general does not produce well. Buds on 1-year-old wood bear fruit. 2, 3, 4-year-old wood, much less frequent that they're going to have a lot of fruit buds. So pruning all of that stuff off every year, don't let those vines become overgrown, and being really religious and talking about the importance of that in cultural, and just cultural management, and that will help their pest management a lot. So here's just a little, this is the Forearm Niffen system. This is a very popular system, but it's not the one that's used all the time. It really, grape growers commercially have all types of canopy, different kinds of canopy systems that they're developing, especially in areas where they're trying to grow cold sensitive grapes in colder areas. They're very, very innovative. But basically this trunk can be kept for a lot of years, many, many years, decades. In Italy, centuries. Here, not so often, but usually we can get decades out of vines. And you want to make sure to have a fruiting cane that has at least 8 or so buds on each of these canes. You want a nice trellis to tie it to. And this renewal spur is important if something happens to this over the winter. So you're keeping that, or even in the season, so that you've got another spur that can come out and take hold and maybe become a fruitful cane. So basically it just looks like that. You have 8, 8, 8, 8. So what's that? 32 different buds, hopefully, that will have fruit. And then a lot of times out here on the ends of these, there's not a lot of fruit production. You may only have 4 or so clusters on each of these canes. And that's totally okay. That is what we want, is those first clusters that form are the ones that are important, and they're going to have the most fruit. Anybody got any questions about grapes? That's really, really quick, but I'm just trying to touch on some of the things that are most important to these plants' production. So Hearty Kiwi, last winter we had an unusual fruit session that we got into a lot more specifics about managing some of these unusual fruit crops. And boy, did I get a lot of blowback about talking about Hearty Kiwi, because in the southern regions, especially down near metropolitan New York, Hearty Kiwi is seen as an invasive plant. And this is a very aggressive vine, absolutely. My question is whether or not this has actually been moved by birds, and apparently there are lots and lots of indications that it has been moved by birds. So this is a plant that we want to be careful about promoting too much. We want to make sure that growers and gardeners understand their responsibility to the natural environment. We don't want them to willy-nilly plant something and then not take care of it. I feel like there's a legacy to this plant that once you plant it, you should have it in your will about who's going to get rid of that plant for you or take care of it. And that will hopefully help people be responsible about it. There's lots of information out there. Oregon State has a great publication. Penn State has another one. There's some different varieties of Hearty Kiwi. They need an extremely strong trellis system because they're a heavy vine, and the pruning required has to be probably 3 times a year because they just grow so aggressively. But they're fabulously great fruit. If you've never tasted one, they're smooth. They're not like the kiwi fruit, the kiwi that's grown in New Zealand. They're not fuzzy. They're like a large, I don't know, I say a large walnut, but they're actually a little bit bigger than that. They store really well. They produce in the fall, so it's a nice complement for apple growers or for later in the season. They're just absolutely delicious. So I love them. They don't require any really specific soil requirements. Anybody got any questions overall about either kiwi or grapes? Just be careful when you do talk about kiwi, because boy, people are very passionate about the fact that these are aggressive and are classified as invasive species. So growing bush berries or cane berries, anything in this kind of multi-stem shrub or cane category, they're kind of bunched together. Elderberries, ripeberries, blueberries, etc. But boy, they're different. And the biggest one that I get questions about are blueberries. And as you probably all know, blueberries are in the Vaccinium family, which is in the Ericaceae, or Vaccinium genus Ericaceae family. And that family of plants is very unusual, like rhodies, like azaleas. They all are super acid loving. So their target soil pH is 4.5. Unless you live or garden in the Adirondacks or the Catskill Mountains, most of our state soils are not nearly that acidic. And so they really have to be acidified. Our water from wells is rarely that acidic. It's usually got some calcium or some limestone in it. And so that keeps it, could be 7, 8 pH. And if you're using that water source to water these plants, it will really slow them down. Their growth won't be nearly what they should be, even if you've got the soil where you want it to be. And if you're dumping higher pH water on it all the time, it really counteracts what you've been trying to do with the soil anyway. So acidifying, or at least knowing what you're dealing with for the water source, is going to be important. But just a little bit, we talk about low bush blueberry, which is a different species than the high bush blueberry. We have northern and southern high bush, and wildly enough, we are getting a lot of information from nurseries and from growers that the southern high bush varieties, some of them, are actually doing really, really well in the Northeast. There's a couple of them. Arlen is one, Liberty is another. They have southern high bush blood in them, and those varieties are being planted more and more. Crazily enough, we think that they actually might do better in certain situations than the northern high bush blueberry. And a lot of this may be because of our changing climate. For those of you who garden in the North Country, Sukewise, you probably are very aware of the Half High series. That's a cross between the low bush and the blueberry and the high bush blueberries, Cornbosum and Augustifolium. And those, there's what is it? Northern Sky, North Blue, North. There's a whole series of Northland type berries, and they are smaller. They have slightly smaller fruit. Patriot is also kind of a northern, but it's not in that same series. But they are very winter hardy, smaller stature, smaller fruit, and a little bit more of that, what we think of as wild blueberry taste to the fruit. So that's kind of important. And then just as a casual thing, rabbit eye blueberry, which I see occasionally in national gardening magazines. This is a very cold sensitive plant. It really is grown as far north of like middle Georgia, but it is not going to be hardy anywhere in New York State. So just to be aware of that. They're big, huge plants too, and much seedier. So if you buy anytime, if you're buying Florida blueberries, which they do have a pretty robust industry, the seeds in them are a little bit bigger, just kind of a little bit more noticeable. These plants all require cross-pollination, and just with different varieties, they are self-fruitful, but they will get a lot bigger fruit if they're crossed with another variety. And then this is really typical, right plant, right place. If you haven't modified the soil, this is what your plant is probably going to look like. It's iron deficient. That iron chlorosis is brought about by pH, soil pH that's too high, along with probably a bunch of other nutrient deficiencies as well, but that's what you'll see. Pruning is pretty basic. Prune in early spring. Don't hedge because most of the fruit is on the very the terminal end of the branch. Remove diseased and broken, old large canes greater than an inch in diameter. Keep about 2 new canes per year. So you basically want 2 one-year-old canes, 2 two-year-old, 2 3, 2 4, 2 5-year-old canes. And so if it's a mature bush, you could have 16 canes, up 2 of every age, and then you remove every year. You're going to remove the oldest cane, which is about 8 years old. That is super important to remember because that rejuvenation and pruning way down into the crown, that's what is going to help you get new canes, which are the most productive wood. Remember, old wood is not productive. So anything beyond 8 years old becomes less productive. And then if you have an old neglected bush, really pruning 20% of the neglected bush you could take out. But honestly, I have seen entire plantings taken right down to the ground, and they come back and they do very well. And in 3 years, you would never know. But that's another way they could try to rejuvenate. Back to the fungal diseases, cankers, Fusicoccum and Phomopsis are our most troubling canker diseases. We do have lots more of them. A delayed dormant spray it's very helpful of lime sulfur. Mummyberry is the fruit rot that's most problematic. We also have anthracnose, some botrytis, but usually not too terrible. But again, all of these you have to spray at least by bloom. And then if people get worried about what plants look like, this isn't that great a picture, but reddening of canes is very normal. Blueberries take a long time to go dormant. And so as they go dormant, their leaves redden, their actual woody parts, the branches redden, and that's normal, no disease. Does anybody have any questions about blueberries? I'm going slower than I wish. Sorry about that.
I have a question about blueberries. So what they sell in the store, it is a wild, frozen, wild blueberries. Is it a variety or they're really wild?
They are really wild. It's amazing when they want to start in Maine, when they want to start a wild blueberry field, they mow the forest and then all the blueberries come up. It's incredible. If you ever get the chance to go out east, they call it, or down east, I guess, in the wild blueberry production areas, there's just acres and acres and acres of this gnarly looking. They don't really name the varieties. They're different sports of different things, but they are completely native to that ground. And that's the great thing about blueberries. It's one of the few fruit crops we have that is actually native to North America. And that wild blueberry is native to Maine.
So does it mean that they're not treated, so they organic or not necessary?
No, I didn't say that. They are definitely treated. Most of the commercial production is not organic. They're not certified organic. They're spraying. They're trying to make sure there's no weeds in that planting system. but they certainly are more natural than, say, a tilled and cultivated field would be.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's very
Just have
cool.
A quick question about blueberry pruning. When you get new plants, you were saying cut the 1 inch, right, diameter canes, but for brand new plants, I mean, new bushes you just bought, you don't obviously know which canes, how old they are. So would you just recommend kind of like, what would you recommend? Yeah.
So what we usually purchase from the nursery are between 2 and 4 year old plants. And those plants, you really don't have to do a lot of pruning. You should remove the blossoms for the first year or two. And then once they get to be about 3 or 4, and you're always trying to remove low branches, like anything that's really little, tiny, little cruddy little low branches, take them off. Any broken branches, obviously, but you can let those plants grow, because even in a nursery, that's still only about a 2-year-old wood right there. So they've got lots of productive time. Having said that, we have a lot of nurserymen that are encouraging growers now, and I have one grower that did this and it worked out beautifully, to take their plants and cut them off and plant them, and then really, you're fertilizing, you're taking care of them, because what we really want from the first year growth, I want to see a new cane that comes out of the ground and is 3 feet tall. That's what we're looking for from a high bush blueberry production. And then it starts branching after that, so that that's kind of that first year's cane growth, though, should be between 2 and 3 feet tall. It shouldn't be, if it's only growing 6 or 8 inches, you definitely don't have enough fertility. Something's wrong. But that cane should be bigger and from the ground. Does that help? Okay. So brambles, quickly, that's all these caneberries. We've got a lot of people growing blackberries. We've got a lot of people growing raspberry and blackberry hybrids, or purple raspberries, red and yellow raspberries. They're all related, but a blackberry is, most of us know this by now because we're able to buy blackberries so reliably in the store, but a blackberry, the receptacle is kept inside the fruit. Anything that has the receptacle still on the plant, so that the fruit is hollow, that's a raspberry. And so whether it's a black raspberry, a purple raspberry, a yellow raspberry, they're still a raspberry. And you probably know that there are different raspberry types. There are primocane or fall fruiting raspberries. So this is a plant that does not need any kind of cold treatment it doesn't need a cold period in order to produce fruit. Comes up, sets the fruit on the very first year, and the second year it can also have some fruit if you don't mow it, but usually people just mow these right off, and so they're able to easily prune them that way. A Floricane, or a summer fruiting variety, requires a cold period. So this first cane comes up as a primocane, a first year cane, but it can't set fruit because it doesn't have that cold trigger. And then the second year, after it goes through winter, gets a cold period, then it will set fruit on the branches, the lateral branches of that, now what we call a Floricane. So first year cane is called a primocane. A second year cane, exactly the same wood, is called a Floricane. And those are just removed. They're kind of gradually removed. Selective pruning, it's called, taking out the old ones and allowing the new canes to proliferate. So red, yellow, black, or purple, can all be in the Floricane, but right now we only have red or yellow primocane types. And trellising really helps, and this is something that a gardener can easily do. It doesn't have to be super fancy. It can just be twine, even anything to try to help keep those canes off the ground. And help also, the thing is it helps the grower keep it from becoming what I think of as a patch. Everybody describes their raspberry patch. That is not a great way to grow raspberries because A, it doesn't have very good circulation. The quality of the fruit is not as good because it's shaded. You can't get in there to prune. So trying to encourage people to not grow their raspberries in a patch, but rather trellis them is really going to be helpful. And then this is for black and purple raspberries. This is a slightly different process because they have a different growth habit. So when you're growing them, they'll come up at about 2 feet. You want to tip them, just tip them. And in order to tipping, that encourages that lateral branching. And then the lateral branches are where you're going to have all the fruit. And a lot of times these will be trained to a trellis so that you can try to keep these laterals, which also are growing like mad and like vines, and keep them up off the ground. And then when they go through the winter, you're going to thin them out to about 2 or 3 canes per hill. They'll still have some laterals that'll all break. And you don't need to tip these guys because they're going to start breaking right away. It's the primicanes that need to be tipped. And then in red raspberries or yellow Floricane raspberries, thinning those canes out. So you get 3 to 4 canes per linear foot of row. I like to have people try to keep the row no wider than a foot. And so you're talking about basically maybe 3 to 5 canes per square foot of row. And just really quickly, the big problem for us with raspberries is wet soil, and verticillium and Phytophthora are often seen in wet soil areas, although verticillium doesn't have to be wet, but it's just a really ubiquitous soil disease. And their raspberries are super sensitive to that. So we see this kind of collapse a lot. One way to tell verticillium, and this isn't a very good picture, but a lot of times you'll have most of the plant collapse, but you'll start to see some little bit of life down at the crown. In strawberries, this is very obvious, but in raspberries as well. And when you see that, that means and it often does not have to be wet either, but that usually means verticillium. Whereas Phytophthora, we will see a whole plant collapse, but you'll sometimes see a little bit of green up in the canopy still, and that usually is not the case with verticillium. And Phytophthora, that's the tricky part about Phytophthora. You always think about it with wet soil, but I've seen this on hillsides. I've seen it in areas that look like there should never have been any pooling water, and still it's Phytophthora that causes the dieback. Ribes are currants and gooseberries. Probably most of us know about trying to avoid white pine blister rust and not planting them if they're not resistant. So it's primarily black currants that are the carriers. They're the alternate host. So your red and your whites, your pinks should be fine. Gooseberries should be fine. Having said that, there are areas in our state, particularly the mountain areas, the Catskills and the Adirondacks, which you are allowed to grow them, but you are supposed to kind of register. So you have to let the New York State DEC know that you're going to be putting in the plants, and then you can grow them. They do have some foliar diseases, so they like good air circulation. Cool, moist, partial shade is okay. Like blueberries, these are understory plants naturally, and so they don't mind a little bit less sun, rich soil. They're very heavy feeders, so you have to keep that in mind. Pruning is very similar to a blueberry, but you are only keeping them as old as year 4. So those are take the year 4 ones out. And then year 1, you're keeping 6 to 8 vigorous shoots. Year 2, 4 to 5 1-year-old shoots, 3 to 4 2-year-old shoots. And you keep removing and thinning them out as they go. Elderberries are a great plant. Unfortunately, we have started to have some issues, pest issues with elderberries. But I think that from a home gardener or like gardening in the forest kind of concept, elderberries are a really great fit. So they're relatively easy to site. They don't need a ton of, they don't need super great soil. They do need a fair amount of water and access to water. And you just need to be able to prune them well enough to keep some of these borer pests out of them, which seem to be the biggest problem I've noticed. Other things that I think would be great fruit crops are aronia or chokeberry. Not terrific to eat out of hand, but really good in if you're using the fruit for nutraceuticals or for preserving or juices. Beach plums, other rubus species like, oh, what's the one? Thimbleberry is another rubus, and that's been, like, I know a lot of people that are planting that. They are delicious, just a little bit different. So there's lots of potential. Honeyberries is another one that's a big one. I should have had that listed here. Honeyberries or Saskatoon, or Saskatoon is, wait a minute, let me think. Honeyberry is a Lonicera. It's a honeysuckle. And is that the Saskatoon? I'm not positive, so I'm getting confused. Hold on a second. I think I've got somebody here. Hold on. Hello? Okay, my son just got home, sorry. So growing ground cover plants like strawberries. Now we have a lot more options. We have June bearing, we have day neutral, and we have ever bearing plants. And the big difference between them is when they produce. And so you can get June bearing are what we normally think of as a June strawberry, where they put a lot of production out in about 10 days. A day neutral plant is planted in the spring, but doesn't really get going until about the end of July. And then we'll keep fruiting all the way until November. And we've got a lot of people growing these. Some of the different varieties are called Seascape, Monterey, Portola, Albion. Very, very nice fruit. And the thing that is a little bit tricky about them is that you do need to remove blossoms and runners for the first portion of their time. Then they will winter and they'll fruit a little bit the next spring, and you treat them like annuals, and then you just get rid of them. Although I know a lot of gardeners that don't get rid of them and still have them fruiting for years, but for most commercial growers, they don't do that well after the first full season. The big thing about these plants is that you want to make sure to plant a strawberry where the soil goes right across the center of this vegetative crown, because the biggest problem I see is that they are not planted deep enough, or they're planted too deep and the plants just don't do well. Let me make sure we don't, before I go into a little bit about spotted wing, I bet you all of you know lots about spotted wing, but let me just make sure that there are no questions about fruit crops in general. I went through a lot of them really fast. Okay, spotted wing Drosophila. Oops, did somebody try to unmute?
Laura, I do have a very quick question about elderberry. I had
Sure.
about elderberry.
Yep.
We had a specimen come in to our lab a couple weeks ago, and the leaves almost looked like they had a mosaic virus. It was a new planting. She had just planted in the spring, and I couldn't really find anything on any kind of viruses that hit elderberry. Have you heard of any?
I have heard of some, and unfortunately, it is hard to get good pictorial, for diagnostics on elderberries. Missouri grows a lot of elderberries, and I do have a contact down there that has been helpful in the past, but they don't have a good, a good production manual. Viruses in general have been increasing. We see lots of viruses in blueberries now that we never saw even 10 years ago. And I don't know whether this is just because it's harder for the nurseries to keep some of this stuff out of the planting, or if our plants are getting stressed so that they're showing viruses that they may have been able to grow right through before. But we definitely are seeing more virus than ever.
Okay.
And unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do. Once the plant is there, I mean, they can rip that plant out and try again.
That's what I suggested. And I also suggested, since it was a new planting, to go back to the nursery where she.
Yes. Yep.
So-
I definitely would. And I would send pictures to the nursery and try to. And also the other little caveat there is this is a good reminder that even for gardeners, it's really important to be able to work with a good reputable nursery. And we don't have a lot of certified plant material out there. I mean, they certainly in the tree fruit industry, they have tons. In the blueberry industry, they're developing it. But we don't have a certified plant system for raspberries yet. We don't have it for a lot of these unusual fruits. None of that is in existence. So a lot of these nurseries are propagating virus infected plants, and it's unfortunate, and it, you know, it's going to be tricky to get away from that actually as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So spotted wing, this is a picture of a grower, small grower that is growing blueberries in this larger piece, elderberries up here, and then has some peaches. And all of this is exclusion netting. And if you haven't heard about all the work we've been doing with exclusion netting, I encourage you to do some Googling around and try to find some articles. There'll be some new videos that we're going to be posting soon about putting up the structure. But this material is a godsend for people who do not want to spray. This is about the only thing that I'm aware of that will guarantee that you can grow high quality fruit without spotted wing Drosophilus, even on a year like this year, and get larvae-free fruit. It is obviously put over the entire planting. It also excludes birds, which is great, excludes hail, it excludes heavy rain, but it is very, 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 very effective. It is not cheap. Our estimates are about $10,000 an acre. A gardener would need a lot less than that. Panels now have zippers in them, so it makes it easier to expand, but the netting itself can last for 10 years. So I think for gardeners, this is a great, great way to try to manage around spotted wing. Otherwise, you're going to be really faced with weekly sprays, and you can use organic materials. We do have some good organic materials, and Trust being one of them, one of the most effective, but it's just very, very difficult to manage this pest is in soft fruit. And there's the link to all the information on spotted wing. So just to kind of go back, making sure that people understand that site selection and soil care is so important. And then resistant cultivars, healthy plants, very important, adequate space, water, nutrients, committing to understanding pruning and training, cleaning up crop debris, providing habitat for beneficials, and knowing the pest life cycles. These are going to be really important to success in the planting. We've got so much information out there for you guys and for the gardener. Lots and lots of information trying to, Cornell kind of revolutionized this IPM, trying to make sure that you're looking for when is the best way to control the pest, when the pest is in existence, and then kind of tying that with the phenology of the plant so that we can, as soon as we notice when we've got a bad problem, then we know that we can spray for it, and tying it with that phenology is really makes it a lot easier to do this and try to explain it to people. I want to just touch on how important permaculture is, and perennial plants. All the things we've been talking about today are part of a permaculture garden, and permanent agriculture is what perennial plants are. So it fits beautifully. But this way of growing, and many gardeners are moving to this, trying to reduce the amount of cultivation they do, trying to keep things in production as long as possible in the growing season, choosing plants that will bloom early, that will or produce early, produce late, add some kind of character to the garden, some structure, having vines that grow up. All of these things make for a more sustainable garden landscape. It's a better fit for gardeners in general. And it is a real bouncing off point or a springboard for talks about mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I think we're all going to have to start to weave that into what we talk about with gardeners and homeowners all the time now, because it is on everybody's mind, and as it should be. So I think that reducing tillage and an emphasis on soil health is an important segue into climate change mitigation, and then just adapting the varieties and things we do is helping gardeners adapt to the change that we are seeing, even in my lifetime. I just want to, I think probably most of you are aware of the Cornell fruit website, specifically the berry website. On the berry website specifically, because we've tried very hard to orient these pages, this website, to commercial growers, but also avid home gardeners. And there's a berry diagnostic tool that has just been updated. My new colleague, and for those of you who are in Western New York, Anya Osatuk is now the berry specialist in Western New York. She took Esther Kibbe's position, but she was involved in last year in trying to update this berry diagnostic tool. It's a fantastic resource, helps growers and educators kind of walk through what might be wrong with their plants. And then the other thing that is great for homeowners is this nursery guide for berry and small fruit crops. You can't really see it, but it has all different, it has Juneberries and honeyberries and Hearty Kiwi and miscellaneous all listed. It directly links to the varieties that are appropriate and also to the nursery's web pages. So it's a really easy way for people to kind of go back and forth. And then I wanted to open it up for ways that people might, and I'm sorry it took so much time. I thought I'd be done 15 minutes ago, but I wanted to just kind of have a little bit more sharing, like how do you guys envision using this little bit of cursory information with your gardening public? Is there, I think from my end, I would like to take a permaculture course because I don't know a lot about permaculture. I know that berries and other fruiting plants can be really easily woven into that. So I think kind of understanding permaculture a little bit better will help me in working with growers and helping them adapt to climate change. Even in a commercial agricultural setting, I've got enough growers that are interested in climate change and trying to do the best they can, that having some good alternatives for them using that permaculture model might help. So I'm going to stop sharing and just open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. This was great. I've literally looked over this PowerPoint that we have for Master Gardeners. I don't even know how many times, but hearing you describe everything and all of the images is so helpful, especially for how to teach this content to the Master Gardeners as well. I just wanted to say from an educational perspective, I know that we have this Gardening as a Forest series, but it's also part of a larger program, which we're hoping to put on in the spring. It will be an in-person kind of field day experience where we're going to learn some permaculture skills, but ultimately creating a small scale food forest demonstration garden. And we're providing some small grants to counties to do this as well. So we're providing some other kind of scaffolding, some other resources around how to learn how to create integrated plant communities around perennial fruiting plants. So this is a great addition to that. And we have a couple of
That's
other.
wonderful. I didn't realize it. I didn't even realize that it was happening. That's fantastic.
It's a small scale program, but we're small but mighty, and we were developing these tools and hands-on workshops in the spring. So we'd love if you're able to make it down and you want to come to this. This will be at in Tioga County, and then also some tours of sites, sustainable gardening sites here at Cornell Botanic Gardens. So yeah, we have a great lineup of ideas for that.
Great.
So
I'd love to hear about that. If I'm free, I'd love to be able to come. Sounds fun.
And for anybody who is interested in taking an in-depth permaculture course, we do offer one through Cornell Garden-Based Learning. And it will start in January, but we've already filled up for the October course, but we have a 3-course series, January, February, March. So just reach out if you want more information on that. But yeah, any questions from the audience? Thank you so much, Laura. This was wonderful. And we'll save. Yep. Oh, Barb's just saying, I want to welcome everyone to the spring workshop on our new CC Tioga farm. Yes. So Barb is spearheading this workshop in the spring with Jenny Kramer, and we're going to bring in speakers on specific topics related to not just permaculture, but basically ecological gardening skills that you can use around this concept. So yeah, I hope you all will be able to make it. We're still working on the exact date, but we're hoping for an early spring or maybe late spring. We're still figuring it out.
Well, the other thing that, and I kind of, I wasn't able to get, and we have some unusual fruit. We have some sessions that were done and taped last year. Some of you may have even attended, but we had Roger Ort was talking, Steve McKay, who was, those of you who are old timers like me remember Steve in the Hudson Valley. He's also an expert at some of the minor fruit, and we have those resources, and I would definitely share them with all of you. I just have to find out from our technicians how you can do that. So
okay,
I have to figure that out, but I will send that, Ashley, to you guys, so that maybe if people are really interested, they can go on the web, you know, it's like a platform that they go on and all the information is there, but the presentations or the webinars are there as well.
That would be great. I wasn't sure if you had to pay for them or if there's but they were wonderful sessions. And
well, we did ask people to pay for them, but you know, we're like making it open to the public.
Well, maybe for this special group, that would be amazing, actually. And that would be the kind of resource we could share. I wanted just to share with folks who might not have been there yet, but this is something that we provide for our master gardeners as an advanced training, including some of the content that Laura has been talking about. So we have the unusual fruits section that Laura worked with Lori on. And so I will be adding this recording to this advanced training section, but also for our main core preparation for master gardeners. And then we also have at the very bottom, a food forest garden design and ecosystem services section that goes into depth into some of these topics, including, that would be a great place to put some recordings from for specific, again, unusual fruit content that you all have. So if anybody, and Roger Ort actually has helped support this and create a planting list specifically for New York State, putting varieties that work well in a food forest setting. So anyway, just putting a shout out for that for folks that want to learn more, take it to the next step. We have this all developed and it's open access to all master gardeners across the state. So we'll be sharing some resources.
That's nice. That's really great.
Well, if anybody has any other questions today, thank you so much for being, again, the second person in our Gardening Like a Forest series. We started out with the mushrooms, we went to the fruiting plants, and we'll probably cover some more ground around soil, I'm thinking, over the winter months. So Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.